G'day, welcome back. In today's episode, Pauline Hanson got censured again, even though Lydia Thorpe called 30% plus of the Australian population filth yesterday within the Senate. Iran is continuing its attacks on its neighbouring Gulf nations. And how does all of this affect Australia? What are the things that we need to be concerned about? What are the things that we should be looking at within our own country? Because at the end of the day, it's the best time for the government to slip things by us and for the government to do things that effectively no one's going to pay attention to because we're all looking overseas. We're going to get into all of that and more on the Mark Pirotta Show.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Blaster! Welcome to the Mark Pirotta Show.
Before we get into the main topics for today, I just briefly wanted to talk about this guy. If you noticed in my last episode, this one popped up and it is a gift from my parents who came from Malta recently. Now, this is a Knight of St. John. Now, the Knights of St. John, or the Knights Hospitalier, are a group of knights who, from the Knights Templar, very similar, effectively defended Malta against the siege of the Ottomans for the better part of 400 years. The Knights of St. John were one of the greatest forces of Catholic militias effectively throughout the entirety of the Middle and late Renaissance ages. They are a symbol of a hedge against Islamic imperialism, Islamic radicalism. And that gift was something that was asked for by my wife. So I wanted to bring it up on the show because I think it's a really good symbol. It's something that has been in my, podcast title, my podcast thumbnail now for the better part of 4 or 5 months. And it's important to me because it represents a lot of things. It represents my heritage. Obviously, within the podcast, I've wrapped it within an Australian flag because that is my country, but it represents my heritage, it represents my ideals, which are Catholic, and it represents the way that I view things, which is righteous conflict, specifically within the lens of debate. At the end of the day, what we are doing here is attempting to create a new communication platform, somewhere where we can discuss ideas, but battle them out. No more softness in the way that we tackle these issues, because at the end of the day, if you are going to be soft about the things that you truly believe in, then you probably don't really believe in them. We're not speaking about angry discussion. We're speaking about discussion that does not lend itself to being swayed by softness, by that insulted me. That, to me, is the greatest decline that we've seen in our political space. It is the, oh, that is very insulting attitude to the way that we do conversation these days. The parliament, in and of itself, just think about that. Parliament quite literally comes from a French word, which is a contraction of the word parler. And to parler is effectively an old pirate term, which everyone knows what it is because of Pirates of the Caribbean. But when you say parler, it's because you both have very, very strong ideas and you say, peace for now, let's discuss, but it's not peaceful. It is effectively a war, but you are discussing the terms of the conflict, seeing if you can find a peaceful resolution through words rather than through physical violence. That's what the parliament ought to be. And so let's segue. In the last episode, I said legway for some reason. But let's segue directly into one of the news stories that I find abhorrent. And it is a continuation of the series that we effectively do where we are disgusted by the people who represent us within Parliament. Lydia Thorpe is the greatest example of someone who should barely be allowed to be in polite society, let alone sitting in the Senate of our Australian Parliament. It is, without a doubt, one of the greatest jokes of our society that we have someone who hates this country so much sitting within the Senate. And so in Parliament yesterday, she stood up after the incredible Larissa Waters sat herself down and effectively tried to state that Pauline Hanson had called her the B word. Watch.
She's called me a Senator Thorpe, do you have a point of order?
I do. I just got called a bitch by the racist.
I remind senators to use respectful language at all times in the chamber, including when they're not speaking. Senator Thorpe, did you have a further point of order?
No, I'm good now, thanks.
Now, whether Pauline did or did not say this is beside the point. Because at the end of the day, Lydia Thorpe has said far worse and for far less. Lydia Thorpe effectively went to Britain on holidays and then spent the entire time just sticking her finger up at statues and monuments of what was one of the greatest empires on earth. Lydia Thorpe is not fit to be within our Senate, and she displayed that quite thoroughly with her speech yesterday, where she lamented the fact that she was only given 1 minute, but I'll be honest, she should have been thankful, because she could barely string a coherent sentence together, and the only one that really made sense in any way, shape or form was the one where she insulted 30% of the population. Not only insulted them, but labelled them as filth. Watch.
Oh, well, I've only got a minute to do this speech, but it's very disappointing to see some so-called senators who represent the filth of this country, which is racists out there, that we know contributes to incarceration, contributes to ill health, contributes to so much hurt and division in this country because of the racist words that come out of Pauline Hanson's mouth.
Order. Senator Thorpe, withdraw.
So Pauline Hanson gets censured. Again, mind you. Pauline Hanson has once again been given a holiday from the Senate, which means that now the fun people on the left can pretend as though Pauline Hanson is of her own accord never sitting in the Senate. But as a general rule of thumb, it's because she always gets kicked out of the thing for saying something that the left deems reprehensible. Pauline Hanson is effectively the only person who can still be cancelled because our parliament system apparently still lives under cancel culture. So Pauline Hanson gets censured for an interview that she did 2 weeks ago, where she did not say what they are claiming that she said, which the ABC lied about and said that she'd said. And it was this. It was a statement where she said that there is no such thing as a good Muslim. But she never said that. She said, "Do not tell me that there are good Muslims when you read the Quran," and then she gets cut off. She never actually said there's no such thing as a good Muslim. But as we discussed on this show, it is impossible. You simply cannot be a good Quranic Muslim and also a good Australian. Because for you to believe everything that is in the Quran, you have to be diametrically opposed to everything that we believe here in the West. It is an impossible coupling. It is like trying to put ice in boiling water and wondering why the ice melted. You'd have to sit there and try to state that the hot water is somehow ice-phobic, and you have to try and blame the hot water for being hot. These are diametrically opposed ideologies. The East and the West exists for a reason. That term first came into fruition not because of the Western American and the Eastern Russian bloc. That ideology first came in because of the Roman and the Islamic societies, the Roman Catholic and the Islamic East. Italy in the West, Islam and Arabia in the East. And so when you start to think about the way that these ideologies exist within each other's realms, it becomes very difficult for you to sit there and pretend as though Pauline Hanson has said anything wrong. But she still got censured. However, Lydia Thorpe, with her statement, was able to stay within the parliament. She has not at this point been censured. Almost no one has made a post about it from any sort of media influence, and somehow she still has the gall to come out and post consistently. She pretends as though Pauline Hanson has done something wrong by using the taxpayer funds that she is allocated for her job in order to do the job that she's meant to do, which is speak to members, speak to the people in her community, and get a pulse of what people actually want from her within the parliament. She made a post today where she effectively tried to state that Pauline Hanson is defrauding the system because she went to members' meeting lunches, took cars in order to get to and from these meetings. But that's what that money is meant to be used for. As I said in that post, or my reply to that post, it's part of the perks of being consistently rebuked by at least half of the Australian population publicly for the entirety of your life. At the end of the day, she's allowed to do that. Yeah, sure, there's been some monetary funds and some documentation that didn't quite go in on time. That's to be expected considering the fact that there is so much scrutiny on Pauline Hanson, even though she is a very minor party at this stage. She gets almost no funding, she's got almost no staffers, and she's expected to follow the same rules that the Liberal Party and Labor have to follow in order to ensure that she actually gets everything that she needs to get done. The number might be larger, but at the end of the day, the workload is pretty similar. So what can we learn from this? The first thing that we need to learn is there is too much femininity in our parliament today. At the end of the day, we've been speaking about toxic masculinity for the better part of 20 years, but very rarely do we actually speak about toxic femininity. That is such a hard word to say. Toxic femininity. You get what I mean. Toxic feminism? That makes more sense. Toxic feminism. At the end of the day, toxic feminism is the major issue with our parliament. Hyper-emotional humans who cannot take a decent, legitimate discussion, who instantly feel insult instead of thinking about something intellectual to say. And as a result of that, we get the scenes that we have in parliament. Basically, all of yesterday was just people shouting at each other over their opinions on Iran and what's happening over across the globe, which realistically should not affect us. And yet, it does. And with that, let's just get into Iran briefly. The first thing we need to say is that the Straits of Hormuz are closed. Now, this strait is effectively the oil highway of the world. Approximately 20% of all the oil that is used on Earth passes through the Straits of Hormuz, and on that trip, they end up going to several refineries around the world. That strait is closed currently by Iran, and for obvious reasons. Choking off supply to the world causes pressure on the rest of the globe in order to ensure that the world stops what the US and Israel are doing. It's a great tactic. They've done a great job. For Australia, that is a dire issue. Because we, for a very long time, due to the climate crazies, have been keeping an ever-decreasing amount of oil and an ever-decreasing amount of diesel in this country. In essence, we have approximately 3 weeks' worth of both of those resources stored within this country. We have almost no ability to refine anything in our country anymore because manufacturing is effectively impossible. Refining is an energy-intensive resource, and so it became too expensive for it to be a feasible product that we could create here in this country. And so, before we get further into the episode, I'll say pause and run to the petrol station. Fill up a jerry can just in case things go south, and fill up your cars because the prices are only going to go up, and at some point we could run out. If this goes for the 4-5 weeks that Donald Trump is currently assessing it may take, and the Straits of Hormuz stay closed for that entire time, the Australian population could be brought to a standstill. We could be effectively locked down again in the same way that we were prior to the end of COVID. And it wouldn't be forced by the government. It would be simply a consequence of the fact that no one can drive anywhere. But not only that, the amount of things that will start going wrong are seriously problematic. At the end of the day, oil and diesel are used as backup generators for everything. If we experience any sort of power outage, it is oil and diesel that keeps us running. Hospitals run on diesel generators, farms run on diesel generators. Almost every major industry still runs on diesel generators to power everything. Imagine a world and an Australia where our public health system collapses because we can no longer support our energy infrastructure with diesel generators. When you have a system that is 50% now almost reliant on renewable energy, which is renewable, but it is also very, very unstable. And we know it is because the wind stops blowing and the sun stops shining. And we don't have the hydro capacity in order to ensure that the entire country can be maintained. We don't have nuclear, which can effectively run the entire country with just water and a bunch of uranium, which we have plenty of. I'm sure there's more complexity to that, but at the end of the day, that's the nuts and bolts of the thing. And so for us to sit here and pretend as though we are not impacted by this conflict is ridiculous. And we ought to be pushing for the US and for Israel to defeat the IRGC, not only on a moral level, because the IRGC is a demonic enterprise, which is a terrorist organization, but also because the Straits of Hormuz being closed directly impacts us and our livelihoods today. Now, while we're speaking about terrorist organizations, we have a hate bill which just got introduced in this country, and however much I dislike it, it is the law. And so I'm sure these powers could have been used before this bill came into place, but when you have mosques openly saying that they are about to mourn the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, I think we ought to be questioning whether that's something we should allow in this country, considering the fact that every major politician who is in some sort of position of influence outside of the terrorist sympathizers in this country, of which there are far too many, then they ought to take a step up and say that is not something that we do here in this nation. But at this stage, Western Sydney seems to be rife with news of memorial services that will be happening. Watch.
Mosques and prayer centres in Western Sydney have announced memorial services for the late Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei after he was killed in targeted strikes. Mosque officials say their community is deeply affected by his loss.
Sadness. We lost one of our biggest scholars, Islamic scholars. He was very well respected from everyone. And it's a loss.
Premier Chris Minns has condemned the vigils, saying the mourning of the Ayatollah is atrocious.
Now, just imagine for a second, because we had people on X coming out and saying, just let these people mourn. The world is on fire. Mary Costa Cartagadaga, something like that. Someone with a very, very decent following came out and said words to that effect. Imagine if the roles were reversed. The NSN, on the 30th of April, announced that they are mourning the death of Adolf Hitler in this country. There'll be fanfare. There'll be flags that symbolize the late dictator, the late Führer's departure. And there'll be people who come out and say, you shouldn't be able to do that. And I hope that those who are saying that this was just a religious leader will come out and say the same thing here, that he was just an ideological thinker. He was simply a man who wanted the best for his people. He was a man who, despite the fact that things were going wrong around him, he himself had nothing to do with it. While we understand that this is satire, this is effectively what the people on the left wing of politics want us to believe about Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That he was simply just a literary genius. He was the leader of a religious movement, and he had no hand to play in the fact that his nation was responsible for some of the greatest terror networks that we have seen on this earth for the better part of 40 years. This is not something that should be allowed within society. As I said in previous episodes, we have freedoms. That does not mean that everything ought to be free. The freest you can be is lost in the forest, but it is not safe. And it's not to pretend that these people are potentially or not potentially terrorists or terrorist sympathizers. Many may be hoodwinked by the fact that this man was simply a religious leader. But there is more than enough evidence that many of these people are in fact terrorist sympathizers. In the same way that we see almost every poll of the Islamic world saying that, to the effect of 90% odd, polling returning saying that people ought to be stoned and killed for being apostates, people ought to be stoned for adultery, and that every major, what we're told is extremist or fundamentalist version of Islam is, in essence, the fundamental. It is the majority. There are actually very, very few good Muslims on earth today. And that's not an overstatement. On earth today, there's over 1 billion Muslims. And the majority of them believe in all of those things. And not for no reason, but because it is within the Quran. There are people who can integrate by subverting their religion. But there are also people who use their positions and use the ineffectiveness of Western laws because of the empathy that we have allowed to infiltrate into our legal system in order to bypass our legislation, bypass our immigration protocols, and get through basically just by calling themselves something that they're not. And we can clearly see that in this next clip. Watch.
We are not dealing with a conventional armed force. We are dealing with a hybrid entity. Part military, part intelligence agency, part business network, part ideological machine. And this is where Australia faces a serious challenge. Our current legislative settings struggle to account for this hybrid structure. We are seeing the consequences of that grey area right now, with the arrival of the Iranian women's national football team into Australia. Many Australians welcome these athletes, and rightly so. Iranian women athletes themselves have shown extraordinary courage. But accompanying delegations include individuals widely understood within diaspora communities to be affiliated with, supportive of, or aligned with IRGC structures. And these people have just landed in our country within the last few hours.
When people can come through and pretend to just simply be part of a soccer organization, it is very difficult to sit here and pretend as though we are safe in this country. When people like the Akrams can do what they did without any oversight, when people like the preacher of hate who preached freely inside of Western Sydney for more than 10 years is able to preach the things that he preaches, when people like Lydia Thorpe are able to say the things that she says, then no, we should not have those sorts of liberties, because liberty can only really be constrained to certain things. Full libertarian view means that I can murder anyone I want with no consequence. That is not feasible for a functioning society. And so there are controls that need to be put in place. There needs to be some sort of metric, and I'll be honest, I don't know how to do that. It is very hard once someone is here, has children, has established a life for themselves to say you ought to go. It's very, very difficult. I don't even know how I'd begin. I have not sat here and thought to myself, how do we start to clean up Australia in a way that ensures that when I go to the shops next, there's not going to be some madman with a knife, that there isn't going to be someone with a gun turning up to my next beach day. I don't know how that works. There might be greater thinkers than I who know how to do that, and maybe it needs to be more brutal than it needs to be nice. But at the end of the day, something does need to change, because there are these people who are being allowed into our country. It is the definition of soft politics and soft policy that we allow this sort of thing to happen. Now let's finish off with two quick clips, because I think this one pretty much sums up how we're doing here in Australia today. It's technically a throwback to what we were talking about earlier with the oil debacle, but I think that it sums up, just Barnaby's statements taken in isolation sum up exactly where we're up to in Australia today. Watch.
Conflict may seem a world away, but the consequences here at home could be dire. Our fuel stockpile is well below the international standard, triggering fears we could even run out, with oil prices already spiking.
Ablaze in the most sensitive and now most dangerous oil corridor on Earth. A Palau-flagged oil tanker burns in the Strait of Hormuz, the channel off Iran's south coast that feeds 1/5 of the world's exported oil and gas.
We're in real trouble.
One Nation's Barnaby Joyce on the decades-long decline in Australian refining that leaves the country highly reliant on imported oil.
But we've got the same old policy, cross those fingers, everything will be fine. We are completely unprepared for this.
And the final thing, because I think that Jacinta Allen is getting a free ride and I haven't spoken about her for at least 2 weeks, which is my bad. I should have done better on that issue. But Jacinta Allen, over the course of the last 24 hours, somehow became one of the most popular politicians in history. She's claiming that it was a bot attack by the Liberals, and the Liberals need to come out and say that they had no hand to play in this. They did not raid her social media with bots. And she's coming out and saying she had nothing to do with it. But in the meantime, while all of that is happening, the real corruption is still happening behind closed doors. The CFMEU investigation and the watchdog into corruption that is currently supposed to be doing an investigation into the government is being hampered by laws that the government creates. And the only way that the watchdog can investigate properly is if the government that is being investigated changes the law. Yeah, wrap your head around that one. What?
Anti-Corruption Commission has confirmed it is currently powerless to examine allegations of rorts on the big build. Adding to that, Labor has now moved to stop Parliament voting to give the watchdog what it needs. State political reporter Heidi Murphy explains.
Fronting up for a rare public appearance.
We are now happy to take any question.
An opening she may have soon regretted after explaining how they don't have the powers to investigate claims of widespread rorting on big build.
Yes or no? Have you specifically written to the government to request the powers you need to investigate the biggest scandal in Victorian history?
We engage with government in relation to legislative reform.
The Commissioner battling on to say IBAC has to work within its mandate.
But we only have the jurisdiction that we have that is set by government. And if government, if government wants to change the legislation, it is a matter for government.
Labor insists it will not be rushed into what it calls any sudden moves on strengthening the corruption watchdog. That means it will be months yet before there's any sign of new legislation.
Like I said, these people are going to start to try and use this conflict as a shield. They're going to try and slip things through. They're going to try and divert attention from the important things that are happening in this country. Yes, the global conflict is important. Yes, we should look at it and assess the situation because what happens across the globe in a globalized world will affect us. But don't take your eye off the ball. Make sure that you continue to hold your own politicians accountable for their failures. Don't let Anthony Albanese pretending to back in the US and Israel today divert from the fact that he allowed Palestine to be named as a nation while its leaders were still Hamas. Do not forget that Anthony Albanese and his party pushed through hate legislation, which so far has seriously done nothing. Don't forget that Anthony Albanese hampered an investigation using a royal commission by time limiting it to 12 months. Don't forget that he did not want to do it in the first place. Don't forget that Anthony Albanese continues to libel Pauline Hanson as someone not to be trusted, as someone who is trying to create division within this nation simply for having an opposing view to his. Because at the end of the day, that's how our parliamentary system works. It's meant to be a parley. It is supposed to be two opposing ideas, not simply what we had with Susan Ley and Anthony Albanese in leadership positions, where it was just Labor and Labor light. You are meant to have a rigorous debate. You are meant to have these arguments. And you, as a citizen, have a duty to keep yourself informed. Your homework for today is to go Google and find the Knights of St. John. Go and learn about them because they have one of the coolest stories in Knights history. Some of the greatest ever war stories, some of the greatest ever creations, some of the greatest battles in history were fought by the Knights of St. John. That'll do us for the show today. I will speak to you guys on Friday. My name is Mark Pirotta, and this is the Mark Pirotta Show. God bless.